Have you ever woken up and felt like you couldn't move, like something was holding you down? Or maybe you've seen a shadow in your room, standing so still it almost looked like furniture, until it didn't. Sleep is supposed to be peaceful, but not everyone wakes up alone. Because sometimes the nightmare doesn't end when you open your eyes. Tonight I'm going to tell you 3 terrifying encounters with the unknown. By the end, you may never feel safe in your bed again. When I was 41, I decided to attend my high school reunion. It had been more than 2 decades since I'd seen most of my former classmates, and nostalgia had been gnawing at me for weeks leading up to the event. I booked a flight to the nearest airport and rented a car to drive the rest of the way. The town where I'd grown up, Coldwater Hollow, was about 50 miles from the airport, and the route cut through desolate farmland and patches of thick, silent forest. Cell reception was spotty at best. About 5 miles outside of town, I spotted a figure on the side of the road waving me down. At first, I considered driving past. It was late, and the road was too isolated for comfort, but something about the way they waved felt familiar. As I drew closer, my heart jolted with recognition. It was Caleb Hartman, one of my old classmates. We hadn't been particularly close, but we'd shared a few classes and played on the same baseball team during sophomore year. He looked older, sure, but not by much. His face was still sharp, his grin just as crooked as I remembered. I pulled over and rolled down the window. "Caleb," I called out, squinting to be sure it was really him. "Hey, man," he said with a wide grin. Didn't think anyone would stop. "Need a ride?" I asked, already unlocking the passenger door. "Yeah. Thanks a ton," he said as he slid into the seat. "Been a long walk." We started talking as if no time had passed. He asked me about my family, my work, and what I'd been up to since high school. I filled him in on my life in the city, my 2 kids, and my job managing a shipping company. He chuckled and said I'd always been the responsible one, which wasn't entirely true, but I let it slide. I asked him if he'd be at the reunion, and he shook his head. "Nah, I'm keeping a low profile these days," he said, gazing out the window at the passing woods. "Just dropped me off near the trailer park on the edge of town." The request surprised me. Caleb's parents' house had been just a couple of blocks from my grandmother's, and I'd assumed he'd still be living around there. But I didn't question it. People's lives change. When we reached the narrow dirt road that led to the trailer park, he patted me on the shoulder. "This is good, man," he said. "Good to see you again. Take care of yourself." "Yeah, you too, Caleb." "See you around," I replied. He stepped out of the car and disappeared into the shadows beyond the tree line. I watched him for a moment, waiting to see if he'd turn around, but he didn't. The woods swallowed him whole. I drove onto the VFW hall, where the reunion was in full swing. Music blasted from the speakers, and the smell of cheap beer and fried food hung in the air. It wasn't long before I ran into old friends. We laughed, swapped stories, and marveled at how much or how little we'd all changed. As the night wore on, someone brought up Caleb's name. "You'll never guess who I just saw on my way," and I said, "Caleb Hartman." I picked him up about 5 miles out and dropped him off near the trailer park. The room went silent. I'm not talking about a lull in the conversation, I mean dead silence. Even the guy singing "Don't Stop Believin'" on the karaoke machine froze, his eyes wide as saucers. My old friend Marcus turned to me, his face pale and serious. "Eli, you're messing with us, right?" Marcus's voice was low, almost pleading. "No," I said, glancing around. "Why would I lie about that?" Eli, Marcus's eyes locked on mine. "Caleb's dead. He's been dead for 6 years. Died on that same stretch of road. Flipped his truck coming around the bend. We all went to his funeral." Laughter broke out from one of the younger guys at the bar, but it was nervous, hollow. My chest tightened. "You're lying," I said, but I didn't believe my own words. "I'm not," Marcus replied. "I'm not, Eli. I swear to God. It's not funny." I felt lightheaded and stumbled outside to get some air. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I leaned against the hood of my car, staring up at the stars through the clearing. My breath came in shallow gasps. I'd seen him. I'd spoken to him. I'd given him a ride. With shaking hands, I opened the car door and slid into the driver's seat. I needed to calm down. Just breathe, I told myself. Just breathe. My eyes drifted to the passenger seat, and my breath caught in my throat. There, resting on the seat, was a weathered copy of the Coldwater Hollow Gazette. I picked it up with trembling fingers. The date on the top was from 6 years ago. My heart stopped when I turned it over. The headline on the back page read, "Local man dies in tragic crash." Below it was a picture of Caleb's face, smiling like he'd just cracked a joke. The same face I'd seen just hours earlier. I've told this story a few times since then, and people either laugh it off or get that same pale, haunted look that Marcus had. But I still have that newspaper, folded and tucked into a box in my closet. I've looked at it more times than I'd like to admit, running my fingers over the grainy print of Caleb's face. Sometimes I'm tempted to believe it's all some elaborate trick my mind played on me, but deep down I know what I saw. I've driven that same road since then, always glancing at the spot where I'd picked him up. I've never seen him again, but every time I'm ready, just in case. After my parents divorced when I was 15, I moved in with my mom. We settled into a small apartment in the quiet town of Maple Hollow. At first, everything seemed normal, but it didn't take long for strange things to start happening. It would often start at night while I was reading in bed. The room would suddenly feel icy, like someone had opened a window during a blizzard. I'd glance around, expecting to see a draft coming from somewhere, but the windows were always closed. Then, I'd feel it, the heavy, oppressive sensation of being watched. It wasn't the kind of feeling you get when someone's casually looking at you. This was sharp, like whoever or whatever it was hated me. The first few times I tried to brush it off, but it kept happening. Every time that feeling crept in, I'd get up and leave the room. I'd sit in the living room or hang out in the kitchen until I felt safe enough to return. If I tried to wait it out in bed, the feeling only grew worse, as if the watcher's gaze was slowly drilling into my back. Things escalated from there. One afternoon, I saw something that made my heart pound. A shadow figure, vague, but clearly humanoid, moved along the wall of my bedroom. It darted from one side to the other, quick as a blink. At first, I thought it had to be a trick of the light. But it happened again, and again. No pattern, no clear source of the shadows. It was just there. One night, something happened that I'll never forget. I'd just gotten home from school and was sitting on my bed, scrolling on my phone, when I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from under the bed. I froze. My heart felt like it had stopped. We had a dog, Cooper, but Cooper's bark was high-pitched and sharp. This sound was deep, menacing, like the growl of a large predator. Slowly, I leaned down to peek under the bed. Nothing was there. I shot up, heart racing, and checked the rest of the room. Nothing. I found Cooper in the living room, curled up by the couch, fast asleep. But that wasn't the only time the dog incident happened. Sometimes I'd hear the growl again, muffled, as if it came from the other side of a wall. Cooper's behavior changed too. He'd whimper in the hallway outside my room and pace back and forth, refusing to come inside even when I called him. I'd see his ears flatten and his eyes fix on something invisible just beyond the doorframe. At one point, I told my mom about it. She chalked it up to stress from the divorce and told me I was imagining things. I wanted to believe her, but every night that icy chill returned. I doubted her words more and more. No amount of logic could explain the feeling of being watched, the growls from under the bed, or the shadow figure's darting movements. The activity continued for months. It reached a point where I'd sleep with my door open and the hallway light on. I'd started talking to friends at school about it, casually at first, to see if anyone else had experienced something similar. Most of them thought it was cool, like I was living in some kind of horror movie. But to me, it wasn't cool. It was exhausting. Everything changed when I moved in with my dad the following summer. He'd relocated to a new place in Cedar Ridge, and I was relieved to leave Maple Hollow behind. The moment I set foot in my new bedroom, I knew something was different. No chills, No watching eyes, no darting shadows. Cooper, who came with me in the move, slept peacefully in my room every night. It's been years since I've experienced anything like what I faced in that apartment with my mom. I've told a few people about it, and some believe me while others think it's just a creepy story I'm telling for attention. But I know the truth. I'll never forget that icy chill or the sound of that inhuman growl. Every once in a while, when I'm alone at night, I'll get a flash of that same dread, and for a split second I'm back in that room, feeling hated by something I couldn't see. During the early years of my career as a psychiatric nurse, I worked at a residential mental health facility. It was a challenging job, filled with long hours and unpredictable days. But no experience there ever unsettled me quite like the one I had with a man named John Carlyle, not his real name. John was what's known as an elective mute. He didn't speak not because of any physical or medical issue, but by sheer will, as if something inside him had decided he had nothing to say. His silence wasn't the only unusual thing about him. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, his frame towering over staff and patients alike. He moved with slow, deliberate steps, always calm but always watching. The first time I read his file, I couldn't believe what I saw. John's story began in the Deep South, where he'd grown up with a large, close-knit family. At 19, he enlisted in the military, following in the footsteps of his older brothers. By all accounts, he was an average young man with friends, ambitions, and no history of mental illness. But one night, during a routine training exercise, John vanished. No one saw him leave, and no trace of him was ever found. He was declared a WOL and later listed as missing, presumed dead. 10 years later, a man walked into a VA hospital emergency room here in the Midwest and calmly approached the front desk. He was coated in dust, his face weathered like an old photograph left in the sun too long. He looked at the receptionist and spoke 7 words that would stick with me forever. My name is John Carlyle, and I've been dead for 10 years. Those were the last words he ever spoke. Hospital staff were stunned. They checked his identity, and sure enough, his fingerprints matched the military's records. His clothes were the same ones he'd been wearing the night he vanished. His social security number hadn't been used in a decade. Nobody could explain where he'd been or how he'd survived. His family was notified, but they refused to believe it. "We've grieved our John," they said. "Whoever's claiming to be him isn't him. Please don't contact us again." And so, John Carlyle became a ward of the system, eventually transferred to the facility where I worked. From the moment he arrived, John's presence was unsettling. He never caused trouble, never lashed out or broke any rules. But his silence wasn't peaceful. It was an oppressive, weighty absence of sound, like standing in a room where all the air had been sucked out. He'd pace the hallways from sunrise to sunset, his footsteps slow but constant, like the ticking of a grandfather clock. Staff tried to engage him. Therapists spoke to him. I even sat with him during my shifts, telling him about my day, hoping that something might reach him. He'd watch me as I talked, tilting his head slightly as if listening. And then, without warning, he'd throw his head back, his mouth wide open, mimicking the body language of someone laughing uncontrollably. But there was no sound, not even a breath. It was like watching a mute actor on stage performing a comedy scene, except nothing was funny about it. The first time he did it, I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. I'd never seen anyone laugh like that, so empty, so hollow. We tried everything with John. Various medications were prescribed, each one met with indifference. No positive effects, no negative effects, as if his body was immune to them all. Occupational therapy sessions were just as futile. He'd be given a task, like folding laundry or putting together simple puzzles, and he'd smile at it, like a parent humoring a child's request. But he wouldn't do the task. Instead, he'd pace. No matter how many times he was guided back to his seat, he'd eventually rise, walk to the edge of the room, and start pacing again. The other patients were wary of him. Some feared him outright. One elderly woman, Miss Eleanor, called him the Hollow Man and refused to be in the same room as him. "He's not a man," she'd mutter, eyes darting nervously toward him. "He's a shadow wearing skin." Despite his eerie nature, John never harmed anyone. In fact, he never even touched anyone. He'd pace, he'd smile, he'd throw his head back in silent laughter. But that was it. On my last day at the facility, I was taking a moment to reflect on the experiences I'd had there. It had been a long, exhausting job, but but I'd learned more in those few years than I'd expected. As I walked to my car, I glanced toward the fenced-in courtyard. There he was, John Carlyle, pacing along the edge of the lot. The sun was setting, casting long, thin shadows that stretched like fingers across the pavement. He didn't notice me watching him. He stopped walking, looked up at the sky, and tilted his head back. His mouth opened into that wide, silent laughter,